Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
As authoritarian Christians gain more power in the United States government today, more and more people are starting to wake up to the presence of Christian nationalism. But many still aren't quite clear on how much of a threat it poses. This past week, CNN advertised a special on The Whole Story with Anderson Cooper that was set to air Sunday night at 8 o'clock.
You believe the civil government should be guided and dictated by biblical law, right?
Yes. Pamela Brown explores the rise of Christian nationalism.
We've never seen it happen as fast as what's happening in the United States right now.
And its growing political influence.
I think that Christian nationalism is going to reshape democracy.
In this one nation under God, is liberty for all?
We know the way that they treat women. We know how bad it is.
The Whole Story with Anderson Cooper, Sunday at 8 on CNN and next day on the CNN app.
Many survivors of Doug Wilson's churches were looking forward to watching it because Wilson has gone from what many considered to be a fringe outlier to preaching at the Pentagon. But unfortunately, the show had to reschedule due to the coverage of the blizzard. Still, according to Fox News, all the concern about Doug Wilson-related Christian nationalism is much ado about nothing. Here's part of an interview between Kaylee McEnany and Pastor Alan Jackson.
Pastor Jackson, CNN went out and found a Georgetown professor who's worried about radicalization. Listen to this.
Memorial service was one of the most potent examples of this shift in our culture that we're experiencing right now, where a large segment of American Christians are being activated by these ideas, radicalized by these ideas that say that they are the persecuted ones and that they need to stand up for Christians' rights.
I know you knew Charlie. In that memorial service, the Holy Spirit was moving. It wasn't radicalization.
No, it wasn't radicalization. It was Orthodox Christianity. You know, the truth is God is moving in the earth, and you see it in the young people that are coming to churches. You see it in the AMA that is repudiating gender mutilation on our teenagers. I mean, there's remarkable ways you see God's values and principles being embraced in our culture. But we shouldn't be surprised. They said Jesus was a radical. They said the Apostle Paul was a radical. They said James and John and Peter, the whole crowd, were radicals. So if standing with Jesus and biblical principles makes us radical, I'll get a T-shirt and stand gladly in that space.
I'll take one of those T-shirts, too.
For many of us who critique Christian nationalism, the Charlie Kirk Memorial Service was, as Matthew D. Taylor put it, one of the most potent examples of radicalization today. You may remember that I featured Matthew D. Taylor's sermon about preaching the gospel in an era of Christian power that he preached at Emory University in episode 61 of Highest Power, Church and State. In other words, Taylor is not someone who hates Christianity. He's a Christian and is speaking truth about how these Christian nationalist worship services are co-opting the church for state power. But to McEnany and Jackson, the Charlie Kirk Memorial Service was simply the Holy Spirit moving. It was Orthodox Christianity. Being a radical Christian is simply standing with Jesus and biblical principles. So is all this concern about Christian nationalism, Doug Wilson, and the merging of Christian worship and right-wing politics simply a left-wing media-created conspiracy against normal Christians? Brian Kaylor is the president and editor-in-chief of Word and Way. He's also a Baptist minister. At his Substack, A Public Witness, he has a page called The Government Worship Watch, where he shares examples of the Trump administration hosting government-sponsored Christian nationalist worship events. And the most recent one included a sermon by Doug Wilson. So for today's episode, I sat down with Kaylor to discuss. I'd like to start with your recent piece about Doug Wilson preaching at the Pentagon and then zoom out from there, because I think Wilson says a lot of shocking things about women, slavery, LGBTQ people, etc. But he often feels like a theological shock jock at times. But in your piece, you said that he preached about the importance of trusting God for protection in battle and praised the monthly worship services as perhaps a sign of a new revival like the Great Awakening or the Biblical Day of Pentecost. And those ideas seem very normal and mainstream for evangelicals. Who wouldn't want God's protection in battle? Or, evangelicals have long talked about revival. So how would you respond to evangelicals who think you're just overreacting about an evangelical pastor sharing some pretty basic evangelical ideas?
Yeah, I think that criticism or that pushback is almost correct. If Doug Wilson had been standing like in his own church, because it really was a pretty traditional sermon and fairly boring, honestly. I mean, I was sitting there watching it live as it happened and knew it was newsworthy because it was Doug Wilson in the Pentagon. But most of the sermon was pretty boring, pretty basic, pretty traditional. It's the context, though, that makes it really different. Because it's one thing to be talking in your church, and I grew up in a conservative evangelical Southern Baptist church, and right, I'm used to these kind of sermons. It's one thing to be standing in your church and talking about trusting in God for protection. But it hits differently when you're talking to the U.S. military. Now you're saying the U.S. military, not a body of believers in a local congregation, but the U.S. military is trusting in God. And a lot of his metaphors then don't actually work really well. Right? I mean, I've heard lots of sermons. I've probably preached some sermons on as well about Gideon and, carving the army down, and then carving it down again and smaller. He uses that as an example about why we need to let God show God's greatness and let God get all the glory by, not having this big, massive army. Well, he's literally talking to the largest army in the world. Like, I mean, I was waiting for like the logical conclusion in that context would be like, all right, now shut it down. Like, let's get rid of all the big budget increases and so on and so on. But no, he's using this example from the Bible to justify the imperial military.
Interesting. Yeah, you would think it would be about, okay, so let's get rid of a lot of our nukes.
Exactly.
But no, it's
just trust God.
Yeah, let's just get more. So like part of the struggle in helping people realize what's going on here, I think, is that a lot of what he says seems normal and even appropriate for Christians. It's knowing your context. If you're talking to soldiers, of course you're going to speak about God protecting soldiers. Or he talks about all of Christ for all of life. Or he says we want God to get great glory and winning. So then, like for those of us who come along and oppose what he's saying, it almost feels like, okay, are you saying soldiers shouldn't pray for protection? Are you saying it should be Christ for some of life, or you don't want God to get glory? So like, how would you recommend for pastors to help their congregations recognize when values they care about or language they resonate with as Christians are being co-opted in ways that harm their neighbors?
Yeah, and that's a really difficult. I'm glad you're asking about this because this is a difficult nuance for us then to try to push out. And I think that's what makes the rhetoric that they use so dangerous is that they are borrowing. And I know you've been working on this on borrowing our music and our worship songs, and they're borrowing our language and our liturgy. And it can be really sneaky because it sounds like, oh, that's what we're about. And I think when we think about this, this slogan of all of Christ for all of life. And while that is something that I do think that as believers, we should be looking to give Christ glory in our lives, it's a completely different thing to then suggest that, therefore, the nation is now under Christ. And by that, of course, they just mean under their interpretation of Christ. And so that's a whole nother thing. That is the Christian nationalism of now suggesting this is not a pluralistic democracy based on the separation of church and state. This is something completely different. And so I think we have to do that nuance of what does it mean to live as a Christian and what does it mean for the government to co-opt this language? So when he's saying that, to the U.S. military, to the Pentagon as a whole, as opposed to an individual soldier, that has a different nuance. One way I think really shows this even more significantly, even than Wilson at the Pentagon, is that the fact that the Department of Defense has been co-opting Bible verses and using them in social media propaganda videos, and they're taking verses like the Lord's Prayer, like a verse from Psalm 23 and Joshua 1, and they're taking these verses and then while they might work, Psalm 23 might work for an individual soldier to pray. It's completely different when you're suggesting that this is about the U.S. military. And while the verse is coming on the screen, they're showing images of fighter jets and missiles shooting off and the U.S. military at work killing our enemies. That's a whole different theological interpretation to the text.
Yeah, I remember like one example was there was a soldier doing the "Here am I, send me" as a way of signing up for ICE.
Yeah, so that's the Department of Homeland Security, but they're doing the exact same militarized violence and taking this verse. It was about a prophetic call to now make it about baptizing a militarized arm of the U.S. government. Like that's not what the verse was about.
Yeah, Or like another one was when they went on that building in Chicago and they were descending on these Black Hawk helicopters. They put out a video with a song that said "All Night Revival." It's like I remember, like I grew up in independent Baptist churches. I went to revival services, and I never pictured descending on apartment buildings in Black Hawk helicopters.
Yeah, right. Even the most fundamentalist pastors have not suggested historically that that's what we were called to do as Christians.
Yeah. So one thing you've been doing that I've appreciated following is you've been tracking these worship services through your government worship watch page. And I've heard some people defend these worship services by claiming that they're providing an opportunity for people from a variety of faith backgrounds to participate. Could you share a bit more about who is actually leading these services and how unprecedented they are and maybe what religious or political messages they're promoting?
Yeah, so this is one of the things I happened to realize late last fall was that Pete Hegseth was holding these monthly worship services, and other than the first one that he started last May, everyone just stopped paying attention. And there was a big attention to the fact that he was holding this service and how inappropriate it was, and then it just kept going. And the Pentagon every month will put out a little tweet or a post on X, basically saying we're one nation under God. Put a couple pictures from the service, and that's it. And usually, even the preacher wasn't in the photo. And so I spent quite a bit of time going down some rabbit holes trying to figure out who had even preached at all of these services. And then since then, I've also been watching all of them live. So that's why I was the first one to report on Doug Wilson as the Pentagon, because I was watching the service live, not even knowing who was going to be there. I just knew it was probably newsworthy. And then they announced Doug Wilson. And I was like, oh, wow, this is, we've got to one of the bigger names now. But I think it's really important to then recognize that there's a clear pattern. So there have been 10 services now. And while Doug Wilson has gotten a lot of attention, he's not an outlier. And he's not really surprising. I mean, it's horrible that he was invited to the Pentagon, but he's not a surprise because he fits the pattern that we've seen. There have been 9 preachers. Brooks Pottinger, who is part of Wilson's denomination, has been Hegseth's pastor. He has preached twice. But there's been, so the 10 services, there have been 9 preachers. 2 of them then are from Wilson's denomination, including Wilson himself. 4 of them are Southern Baptist pastors. And then 2 of them are from the Billy Graham family. It's almost, I guess, its own denomination. Or so it's from the Samaritan's Purse. Franklin Graham, who preached the special Christmas service in December and praised the God of War. And I know you've covered that as well. And so that's a significant theological frame happening here. And then also one of his sons has preached. And then there's a former NFL football player turned kind of Hegseth associate ministry preacher and has also gotten in trouble at the SEC for insider trading and so forth. So, but they're all from the same narrow slice of right-wing patriarchal Christianity as Hegseth. So there's not diversity here. There's not even diversity within the Protestant tradition, let alone Catholics and Jews and Hindus and Muslims and so on and so on. It's a very narrow slice of right-wing Protestant Christianity. This is Hegseth inviting and establishing his brand of Christianity. Now, as far as the unprecedented thing, there always been, kind of services in the Pentagon that have been on a much smaller scale, right? So this happens in the military bases all around. You have military chaplains, and their job is to facilitate worship for all religious traditions. And so a chaplain is very much different than like a preacher or an evangelist in that their job is often very administrative. And so I think it is significant that this is coming from the guy who likes to call him Secretary of War, is still Secretary of Defense technically, but it's coming from the Secretary of Defense is hosting worship services and inviting everyone, as opposed to the chaplains organizing mini services for all the different faith traditions. So this is unprecedented to have it coming from the top, and that changes the dynamic in a hierarchical society and organization like the U.S. military. When the chaplains offer lots of programs, you can go to the one or all of them. However, if you're a religious seeker, you could go try them all out. But when the Secretary of Defense is hosting a specifically organized Christian worship service, inviting you as the Secretary of Defense, and then always on stage, meaning he can look out and see who's there. Plus, it's always video, and they always show the audience in the video as well. It's not just like on stage. So they could go back and look at the archives even if they wanted and see who's there. Do you really feel like it's voluntary? Or do you really feel like if you're trying to get a promotion in the military, or now they're inviting defense contractors, if you're trying to get a contract, do you feel like it's voluntary? Or is it going to hurt your chances for a promotion or for a contract if you don't show up for that FaceTime?
Yeah, that makes sense. So, like, one thing we've seen a lot of these Christian nationalist worship services outside of the government, especially led by people like Sean Foyt or Ross Johnston. And one theme that I've noticed in those worship services is they often talk about worshipers as being the army of God and the family of God. And so, like, on one hand, they present themselves as an army who's wielding worship as a weapon to fight their neighbors. But on the other hand, they're a vulnerable family and they're simply inviting their neighbors to feel the love of their good father. And so, like, do you notice any similarities between those events outside of the government and these services that are within the government, that maybe include both aspirations to power and invitations to intimacy, or are these government services different in some way?
So I don't think they're different in the content, like what you were just describing. We're seeing both those types of songs, and most of the services so far have just been either someone from the Pentagon or the preacher leading the worship songs. There have been two of them so far, including the most recent one where they've had special music guests, and I think that's going to become more common. At their Christmas one was the first time they had Matthew West as the bigger name, and Wilson, and then the more recent one they had Matt Hammett. And Sean Foyt's coming, right? I mean, he's pretty much all but said that he's going to be showing up soon on X. So I do expect that Foyt's going to be inside the Pentagon leading music at one of these soon. But what I think is, again, the context really does matter. I've been concerned. I've been at events where Foyt has led music, and he does like these the songs, right? This is how we fight our battles, right? We're fighting our battles through music. This is part of the spiritual warfare is through the music, and it's alarming when it's at like a Christian nationalist MAGA type rally. But it's going to be even more concerning when he's singing that inside the Pentagon as part of an official government-run worship service. And so I think the content is similar, but again, it's so much more alarming when it's our taxpayer dollars are organizing worship services on behalf of the federal government.
Yeah. So one song I've noticed, I looked at your list of songs that have, because you do give the names of the songs that they're singing at some of these worship services. And one song I've noticed that has repeatedly come up is How Great Thou Art. It's appeared in 4 of the services that you listed the songs for. And it's also the song that they sang at Trump's victory rally. And it's interesting because there's this line in that song that says, "Thy power throughout the universe displayed." And it's like they sing a lot about the power of God, the greatness of God, about God being a mighty fortress, but they tend not to mention the humility of God or the fruit of the Spirit. And it often ends up like, well, the way they talk about the power of God, it's not about the power of God in and among the least of these as like a healing and liberating power. It's about the power of God reigning through them. And so, God's power is displayed through their power. And so how would you recommend for pastors to help their congregations rethink assumptions about power, about God's power being connected to their power?
Yeah, this is such an important challenge for the American church today. I think Christian nationalism and getting caught up in power quests can be dangerous for the gospel anywhere, but it's much more of a temptation when we're living in the world's largest empire. It's much more of a temptation for us to confuse our Babylon with the kingdom of God, and to confuse military might, well, a might makes right type of theology. And so this is what we have got to do better, because they're in our text. We have them throughout, the Old and New Testaments. We have these texts that show us that, some may trust in chariots. Just a, modern version of that is tanks and, aircraft. Our fighter jets and our battleships and all those these are just modern chariots, and others trust in the Lord, right? And we have all of these texts about beating our swords into plowshares, and yet we get caught up in the imperial violence and the imperial power, and that's what we have to help people in our country recognize, that this isn't the way of God. This isn't what God has called us to do. And this year, particularly as we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of America, all of this is getting supercharged. And so we have to work even harder in our pulpits to help people read the Bible from the margins, because that's where it was largely written, was from people on the edge, in the margins, being persecuted and killed by imperial violence, Jesus was killed by imperial soldiers, and so we need to figure out, how do we read the Bible from there as opposed from the heart of the imperial military, the literal Pentagon.
Yeah. So as some of these events like the 250 anniversary and the preaching at the Pentagon, as a lot of these are starting to become more public and obvious, there are a lot of legacy media outlets like CNN who are starting to cover these events, and they're starting to talk about Christian nationalism more. And oftentimes I've noticed that the reporters are confused or perhaps surprised at topics that religion journalists have been covering for years, if not decades. And so, like, what are some of the things you've appreciated about the attention that's being drawn to Christian nationalism from places like CNN? What are some concerns you've maybe noticed in their coverage? And how do you see religion journalists playing a role in warning the nation about what these authoritarians have planned for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great way of framing the question, because it is good, even though I often have some complaints about how the larger legacy media, mainstream media is covering. It's better that they're covering the concerns and the dangers of Christian nationalism than not. Right. So really, like, the Pentagon worship services haven't really received attention since the first one in May from CNN, and all these larger, Washington Post and so forth have virtually ignored them. There was a couple pieces about Franklin Graham and Christmas, but other than that, we haven't seen this rash of attention until Doug Wilson. So it's great. I mean, Doug Wilson preaching at the Pentagon deserves more attention and scrutiny. So I'm glad that they're doing that they're rising to the occasion and showing up. But they're still missing so much that has been happening, right? They're almost treating Doug Wilson like an outlier. Most of the reports will say, "Oh, they've been doing this monthly," and then no consideration of who's been there monthly. They haven't tried to look into them, and they don't even have to do the work anymore. I already published the whole list on our Government Worship Watch. They could just copy the names down, but they're not putting it in context. And I also think they don't have the long-term view of what does this actually mean. And so, Christian nationalism is often portrayed as just kind of a Trumpian MAGA thing, where it predates Trump. And this is, we don't have time to go through all that, but Christian nationalism has a long history in America. That we've had this debate as to which side we're going to do. Are we going to be church-state separation, or are we going to be Christian nationalism? And I also think they miss a lot of the theological nuance. This is one of the reasons why, for instance, I always list the worship songs, because I do think that's fascinating. I list the Bible verses that they're using. I note that they're saying the Lord's Prayer communally during every single one of these Pentagon services. None of that stuff makes it in the other services, because they tend to focus on them as political events, as opposed to looking at how religion is being co-opted and used to justify an agenda that's not just political, but is also theological. So, for instance, on the Doug Wilson one, in the headline, I talk about how he's comparing the Pentagon worship services to the day of Pentecost. Like, to me, that was a big thing. I put that in the headline. And then there's a quote where he clearly does this, where he talks about, God can work even through worship services at the Pentagon, and then immediately goes straight into quoting a verse from the day of Pentecost in Acts, right? And then he gives the citation, and he goes on and kind of makes that connection. But if you look at CNN and the Washington Post and several other news organizations that have covered Wilson, they all do that quote about how even God can work in the worship service at the Pentagon, and then they stop it. Like, they don't get why it's so significant that he literally, with no transition, not even a filler word, went from saying that to quoting a verse about the day of Pentecost. Like, they don't get the significant theological argument that he's making there, that I think is really dangerous.
Yeah, and that's why I've appreciated the work that Baptist News Global has done, and the work that you've done with Word and Way, is because, like, there needs to be a space today where we get into that theological nuance and explore some of the root of the fruit that we're seeing.
Exactly.
So I know a lot of this can be confusing for people, especially when a lot of the Christian language Christian nationalists use can seem so normal. So, but I appreciate you coming on to help us sort through it all. And I definitely recommend people checking out your site and following your work. Do you have any recommendations on where people can go to find you?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks, Rick, for all the work that you do, as well as for having me on here to talk about some of this that's happening. Yeah, people can find my reporting on Christian nationalism at publicwitness.wordandway.org. That's our email newsletter, A Public Witness. And on that, up at the top, there's a little section that says Government Worship Watch. And you can see the list of everyone who's preached at the Pentagon so far, as well as the Department of Labor has also started their own monthly worship services inspired by Pete Hegseth. And then also my newest book that just came out in October is The Bible According to Christian Nationalism. nationalist. And this is particularly looking at how the Bible is misused in politics today, and then also how we can read the Bible better, kind of what you were talking about, like what can pastors do? This is my attempt to suggest what we can do to help people read the Bible better and not be misled by how it's being co-opted in politics today.
Thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and we'll be back with another episode on Thursday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.
This episode was produced and edited by Mac Bowles of TKG Communications, LLC, Dallas, Texas.